Shall I start? Okay. Looks like everything's ready for me to start. So hopefully everybody's in the right room for a metaphor discussion. If not, well, there's one other option. So because this is B-Sides, that's my company. If you want to know more, ask me later. So let me introduce myself. This is me. As you can see, I've been at this for a while. And this is what I do. So this is not your normal security presentation. This is a presentation on Metaphor based on a paper that I wrote a while back. The presentation fundamentally is about language, how language informs our thoughts, and how our thoughts form our language. It's a mental loop that we go through. That's how neurological structures function. And we can go deeper into that after this talk if you're interested, but I'm limited to only half an hour today. So fundamentally, the thing to take away is language is reality because the human mind processes reality as language. So to introduce Metaphor, we tend in IT and in information security in particular to communicate with too little attention towards our audience. We often agree what individual words mean, although if you look at the comment section on the internet, you can see that's not always the case. Complex ideas, however, take time to explain because concepts build upon concepts. And the faster you talk, the faster you communicate, the more ambiguity there tends to exist. So we focus on metaphor, which is a concept in which one concept represents something else. So it gets deeply meta the deeper into this you go. But it's a framework. It's a framework we use to understand the world, to communicate with others, and to understand how things work. So there are some standard metaphors we use in security. One is security requires safety and protection, such as the castle. Willingness to stop, slow down, and assess, or fast, reliable communication. All of these are metaphors that work within the security space. So what does this mean? One common example of metaphor is argument of conflict. This is, a way of talking about metaphor, thing one as thing two. And this comes out of a work by Lakoff and Johnson called Metaphors We Live By. They basically created the field of metaphorical analysis about, I think, 30 years ago. So in argument of conflict, you see language used. People say things like, his claims are indefensible, using the defense model. He attacked every weak point in my argument. His criticisms were right on target. That right on target language is used. And I demolished his argument. So you have amorphous concepts such as working through disagreement, compromise, understanding others that are made more easy to understand as physical constructs, which are what we use in the day-to-day world. So how is this used? Metaphor is used generally at a high societal level, but as you dig into specific industries, you see specific metaphors. As you dig deeper into specific teams, you might see teams develop their own metaphors. Families have their own metaphors, and the tighter the social group, the better the metaphors resonate because the more common their background is shared. Now, metaphors also frame thought. So this is where small groups often get caught. If ideas form language and language form ideas, this loop is created, and you can get caught in this loop. A good example that I'm going to go through really quick is in Switzerland, they make watches. So they've made watches for hundreds of years. And their mental concept of what a watch is a bunch of gears working together. And the better they can make the gears, the smaller they can make the gears, the more reliable they can make the gears, the better the watch is. Fundamentally, their concept of time is that of interlocking gears. And that metaphor ran the world for years until Japan came on the scene and decided that a watch could actually be represented as a little LCD display. And all of a sudden, Switzerland's hold over the market collapsed because the world's metaphor for what time was started to change. And we see this in all industries. Whenever there's a disruptive tendency that affects the world, like when Apple released the iPod, that wasn't a new technology, but what Apple was able to do was shift the metaphor for what music was. And because of that, they took a stranglehold on what was going on. Well-chosen metaphors promote understanding, and poorly selected metaphors inhibit understanding. With a poorly selected metaphor, you wind up thinking in terms of the metaphor, not in terms of reality, because the brain is matching that linguistic processing center, and you're not necessarily seeing what's going on. So you don't see when the environment changes, and you wind up getting stuck doing the wrong things. We saw a great example of this a few years ago. APT stands for Advanced Persistent Threat, and that's a metaphor that the US military created to identify attack targets or attack sources without linking them to a specific country or a nation state. So it originated in the US military, and then it hit the public consciousness when that Mandiant report came out. And that's when the metaphor started to shift, and we saw it shifting from attackers as nations to attackers as APT, APT as advanced malware, APT as malware, and then all of a sudden you have malware vendors saying we protect against APT. And it turned into a marketing buzzword because the use of that construct shifted. This was a failure of metaphor because of ad hoc metaphor mapping. People didn't really think through how they were using language, and they lost control of it. Now, it can also be used as a communication accelerator. There's been a lot of research in this in the fields of linguistic, philosophy, and psychology. And basically, metaphor is not necessarily a replacement for factual statements. It's intrinsic to the brain, and the brain requires metaphor to handle complexity. Okay? The more complex of a topic you're talking about, unless you're talking with somebody who has the same level of knowledge as you and you're exploring it, but the more complex, the more meta you've got to go, the more metaphors you have to use to communicate. Basically, it functions as a form of lossy compression that the brain uses. And instead of necessarily doing a full loss-free expansion, it is used to recreate concepts. And that's why if you try to think back to something that happened back in second grade, there's a reconstruction process your brain goes through. You're not actually remembering what actually happened. So it's a space-saving device. And this causes problems when you're talking to people outside of your field because they have different expansion algorithms for the same words you're using, and misunderstandings can really abound. The factual statements that you use when you check in and verify that other people are thinking about what you're talking about, those are basically checksums to the lossy compression algorithm in how things are working. Fundamentally, though, it's an iterative process. And it's focused on speed, but it's fundamentally imperfect. So you need to focus on the gaps in communication and get better understanding where those are to better communicate with others, because you have metaphoric breakdown. Metaphors can fail or break down when they're overly restrictive or when they fail to extend in the direction you want them to go. Now, Scott Graneman down in St. Louis did a study a while ago and collected a bunch of security analogies. And it's worth looking at his work. It's just interesting what he was able to do. But I'll go through a couple of examples. So this one is distributed denial of service as phone calls. Okay, and this is used to explain what DDoS is to non-technical people. And the metaphor that people use is, imagine you have a business and you've got a secretary sitting there and she's answering the phone whenever it rings, and you suddenly have 1,000 people calling in, and whenever the phone's picked up, there's nobody there. But you can't tell the difference between a good one and a bad one, so you have to keep answering the phones. So that's the metaphor. But it breaks down because in modern days, you've got caller ID. So, how do you deal with that situation? Modern days, you can expand a call center to India or wherever and get additional call volume. So the metaphor explains the attack only up to a point, and then as people start to explore it, they realize, it kind of veers off in another direction and can actually serve to inhibit communication, not improve it. You also see a breakdown in adware as paparazzi. So with adware, you have an application that's installed on a system and kind of follows you around the internet, logging the sites you visit, the purchases you make, the ads you see, and it sends all the information to a third party. So it works at that level. But it breaks down because the paparazzi don't usually inject malware into people's systems. They don't do that level of attack. They're not usually engaged in theft. So as you explore the metaphor, it starts to fail, and you have to recognize where that failure is so you can bring in another metaphor or shift to more technical communication. One that I really liked that I'd never run into until I started reading Scott's work is storage as shelves. And the idea here is you've got a row of shelves. Each shelf has boxes on it. Each box is filled with stacks of paper. Each stack of paper is like a file. Each box is like a cluster on a disk. And large documents are stored in multiple boxes, but in a relatively random order, just kind of based on what space is available in each box. So you need an index, and that maps to how file systems work. But as you dig deeper under the hood, you see that there are different formats in file systems, ext2, 3, and 4, NTFS, XFS, GFS, riser if you're crazy, and all sorts of things you can do there. So these are all different types of indices that handle the different filing systems differently. You also have a problem or opportunity in file systems called slack space, where you can store things in boxes that aren't indexed or are indexed in a different way, and that breaks the shelving metaphor. So you see breakdown because of complication. You see breakdown of metaphor because of age. Some people don't store paper anymore. If you talk about this kind of thing to people that are in high school, they've probably never stored a physical file. Their entire lives, everything's been digital. You also see breakdown at technical levels because things differ between different file formats. Because metaphor can be general or specific. Now, IT is rife with general metaphors. We know that we've all heard the internet is an information superhighway. You see this information going down, and if you want something fast, you need more lanes. But as we learned a few years ago, it's not exactly like a highway. It's not like trucks taking stuff back and forth. It's really a series of tubes, right? So that sort of discussion can be positive or negative depending on what you want to talk about. Now, in 2008, there was a project to create artificial information security metaphors. And in the first round of this process, they found the normal ones that we see. The fortress castle metaphor, which we've all heard. Cops and robbers, we hear a little bit, not quite so much. Securities warfare was not as common in 2008, but it's all over the place now. And then they went through a concept mining exercise. And they found metaphors around biology, the medical field, economics, things like that. So one example was they tried to create this architectural metaphor where you build security into something. We've seen that in various papers and presentations and things. But that's generally a metaphorical failure because very few of us are architects. Very few of us are actually building something new. We're more having to add something to a network that already exists or a system that already exists. We have to deal with already built environments, and the building in model just doesn't work. In the healthcare space, we saw some attempts to use security metaphors in measuring health. You have a health check of the network. You need to do preventative maintenance, which is dealing with vaccines or whatever. But you have a failure because we're not really good at using medical metaphors in the medical field to begin with. We are fundamentally not good at taking care of ourselves. So if you take a failing metaphor from one industry and apply it to another, you just have a failing metaphor over there too. The better you understand the metaphor, though, you can anticipate the breakdown. And that results in favorite metaphors. So I ran a contest a few years ago on a private security mailing list for people to share with me the metaphors that they found that worked best. So as expected, the castle metaphor was one of the first ones popped up. Okay, so Michael gave me this one. And in this, you see a metaphor, security is like a castle. You've got walls, a moat, archers, guards, a drawbridge, and a secret door so people can bypass the hassle if you need to. And we got to see the secret door quite a lot in the Lord of the Rings movie with Legolas coming down and doing crazy elf stuff. So this is the core of the metaphor. You have a problem with untrustworthy townspeople. They know where the door is. They could be compromised. They could tell the attackers what's going on. If the attackers focus on the people, not the infrastructure, then the back door will be used, and it will be used for attack. So the metaphor is useful but it completely falls apart as soon as the person you're talking to says, oh, but I trust my people, right? And you have to understand where that fail point is, so if it comes up, you can shift, pivot, and start talking in a different way, and in this case, have a discussion based on trust. This is another example of going to a doctor. Somebody goes to a doctor for the first time in many years, might be a lot of findings from the blood tests, the blood pressure tests, whatever's going on. Which ones are actionable? So here's the core of the metaphor. The younger you are, the more time you have to deal with some of these things. If somebody goes to the doctor, they're 25, haven't gone for 10 years, it's very different than if somebody goes to the doctor, they're 85 and haven't gone for 10 years. Some things are more fixable than others. And this matches the security fits at the beginning of the project kind of metaphor, right? But it's going to fail if people dislike doctors, if they're big homeopathy believers, something like that. So you have to know how the audience thinks so you can choose these mental algorithms that are going to exist in their brains too. So this was one of my favorites, security as a submarine. So in a manned submarine, it's useless without the people. It has to protect the people and to get them moving. You have to be a little bit careful about the doors. Doors on a submarine, kind of important, because they serve two functions: keep the people in and keep the water out. So you have to have a breach plan. What happens if water gets in? How do you clean up? How do you make sure the security is still good in that situation? There's a lot of insight in this one basic metaphor. It's very useful. It's highly extensible, highly flexible, fast, and easy to understand. And it's completely derailed when somebody says, what's a submarine? Right? This works in the US because we went through World War II. We know what submarines are. It's in our movies. It's in our books. But if you take this to somebody who lives in the desert in Namibia, they're not going to have any idea what you're talking about. And then you've got the sports metaphors. So this one, metaphor, firewall as a defensive line, other technologies as linebackers, good code as cornerbacks, WAFs as safeties, SOC as coaches, lead as defensive coordinator. Like the submarine, it's highly flexible, but it's a total failure if you don't know football. I don't know football. I got this metaphor, and when I was reading it, until I got this from Jonathan, I had no idea what cornerbacks and safeties did. So it worked in reverse for me. This is what I understood of the metaphor. It helped me understand football. To be successful, metaphors have to be selected to facilitate communication, and the introduction of metaphor should decrease complexity, which gets into audience. So most businesses have lots of stakeholders. And this draws from a paper that Forrester wrote called Planning for Failure. Now, the paper itself doesn't have that much that's new in it, but it does lay out the stakeholders in a useful way. So if you look at the stakeholders in a business, you can use concepts that are adapted to match the metaphors they're likely to use. And this is going to be better accepted than technical facts because you don't have to keep backtracking to explain the technical issues that are behind what you're talking about. So if you're talking to all employees, you're not going to have a lot of shared background to work with. So you have to use general, more cultural metaphors. A lot of people, particularly in the US, you can assume most people have gone to school, at least to a certain extent. So security as learning is going to work. A lot of people have families, so security as protection works. People that are rich enough to have vehicles or homes, you can use security as maintenance. You can also use security as resource management, dealing with finances. Now, in IT, it's a narrower group, more shared background, so you can use metaphors that resonate a little bit better. If you're talking to Windows people and you're a Linux person, you can basically link technical concepts between the two, even if the technology itself is different. You can remap security concepts to general tech issues. You can say a denial of service attack is like a runaway process. Remote code execution is like a user left themselves logged in and somebody walked by and did something on their computer. They'll understand that. If you're working with law enforcement, there's a breach, you've got law enforcement people coming in. Law enforcement is an isolated culture. Anybody here in law enforcement right now? Okay. So if you work with law enforcement people, you'll notice that I've seen two types. People that really are driven to protect others and people that are really driven to control others. And it really helps to know which type you're dealing with when you're talking so you can select the metaphor appropriately. We often see this with the FBI. Who's worked with the FBI ever? Anybody in InfraGard? Okay, few people. So in general, since the camera's not pointing at you, who has a negative opinion of the FBI? Anybody? Okay. Most audiences, there's more people raising their hand for that one. The FBI has a serious metaphor problem because whenever they're in the news or on TV, they're either portrayed as evil or clueless. You know, you get the X-Files view of the FBI, and you get the media saying, oh, hey, they're spying, they're doing this, they're doing that, they shouldn't be doing that, when all the good stuff doesn't show. So unless you really understand what's going on, there's this communication gap between the FBI and the media, between the media and everybody else. So there's two areas where communication can fail, and it almost always does. So if you're dealing with law enforcement, unless you know otherwise, you have to assume they're non-technical. You have to frame the discussion around why it matters. Focus on security as protection, damage, and capture. They'll understand that. You'll get past those initial communication hurdles and be able to dive into what matters pretty quick. And finally, there are external service providers. So these are vendors, companies you're working with, and these people are highly concerned with blame. Because if you can lay a problem at their door, you could leave, they could lose a lot of money. So they almost always fall into blame deflection mode, and you have to understand that and work through it. So the business model, you have to understand the business model is almost always higher quality or lower cost. And both models, if the blame falls on the business, the blame risks the business that they're facing. So they have very strong incentives not to be blamed. Now, metaphor conflict will happen, and they will try at their hardest to prevent the blame from falling on them. So security as blame is only going to work if and only if you can lay the blame somewhere else. So what tends to work better is focusing on security as discovery, telling them, hey, I need your help to figure this out. You know, we're a team on this. We need to make sure it doesn't happen again. So you can get deep enough into their system, their technology, their people, and understand what actually happened. Then if it's actually their blame, because you've been working with them together for a while, they're more likely to work with you on resolving the problem. So how do you do this? There are lifestyle metaphors that social engineers have really been focused on for a while. They don't really call it metaphor research, but that's what they're doing. So you stereotype people. You can look at people by age. Generations tend to communicate better internally. You can look at by race. You know, you get language choices. There are issues of prejudice that come up. A class has economic options, societal expectations, hobbies, you know, baseball, cooking, photography. If you know what somebody's doing, you can understand a little bit about how they think, and you can select metaphors appropriately. In summary, people understand best what they already know. So if you're going to have to regularly communicate with somebody who does fishing, you know, you should probably learn a little bit about how fish work, you know, how people find the fish, how, you know, what kind of gear they need, things like that. If somebody does a lot of cooking on the side, you should know about food prep, you know, security as prepping the ingredients ahead of time so you're ready if you need them later. You know, those metaphors will work. If they're a baseball fan, learn a little bit about the game. If they're a football fan, don't worry about it because it's completely incomprehensible. But basically, people will not attempt to understand you until you attempt to understand them, which is where personas come in. Now, in agile development, personas are used intrinsically as part of the development process in a lot of cases. And this is basically identifying a person to help define applications and systems, how to design systems, how they're going to be worked with, and people assign names. And generalities help, but specifics help more. Now, word of note, you have to be careful when using stereotypes this way, because it's very lossy compression. They're basically metaphors that allow for fast framing. And they can be used to trap real people in boxes that don't match them. The reason to go through this exercise is to speed up communication and make it more accurate. So if you are trying to fit somebody into a stereotype that doesn't fit, the stereotype has to change because the person will not. Now, the three we're going to go through are US-based metaphors. If you're working outside of the US, you may need to adapt this accordingly. So, 3 examples here and I'm done. Looks like I might actually hit time. So, this is George. George is white, college-educated, 50-year-old bank manager. He uses his computer mostly for email and web browsing. He's divorced amicably. He's got 3 kids. One is starting a family, so he's got 1 grandchild. 1 in college, 1 still living at home. He likes to grill outside on nice days. He attends church, but not regularly. He's dating a woman 15 years younger than him, which may be the reason for the divorce. Played basketball in college. He has fond memories of it. Votes regularly, tends to vote Republican. And he's renting a house as his ex-wife kept the first house. Now, this information is generally public data. If you use Multego, a little bit of Google searching, you can find this kind of stuff out for almost anybody. So what does this tell you? Metaphors that would work well with George. Security is learning will resonate because he went to college. Security is doing what's right works well with family people and conservatives. Security, as cooking works well. He likes steak. He likes to grill. So you know that some things take time. You have to have everything ready. You have to select properly. Things like that. Security as sports works well because of the basketball he did in college, and security as protection works well because he has a family. So let's look at another one. This is Dana. Black, college-educated, skilled with computers, but only as an end user. 23-year-old insurance agent. She's entrepreneurial. She runs a party planning business on the side. She's dating, not very serious about it. Has some credit card debt due to youth. She regrets the debt, but not what she did in her youth. She's very religious, attends a Christian-based church each Sunday, volunteers there, also volunteers at Big Brothers Big Sisters, votes occasionally, Democratic, dislikes sports but does like to read, mostly mysteries. So what does this tell us? Because of the culture and the college background, security as self-improvement will work well. Security as risk works well with entrepreneurs. Security as duty works well with people who are highly religious. Security as learning, anybody who went to college who likes to read, that's going to work. Security as discovery will work because she likes to read mysteries. And security as helping others, as a Democrat, as somebody who volunteers, that's probably going to work better for her than for other people. So the final example, this is Tommy. Tommy's second-generation Vietnamese, high school educated, highly skilled with computers but self-taught. 35-year-old database administrator. He has a long-term boyfriend but no plans to legally marry. Not involved politically at all, lives with 2 dogs. He is Buddhist, not very serious about it. Financially stable, saving for retirement. Learns about 1 computer language per year. Plays online role-playing games in his spare time. He has actively avoided business for his entire career, and he's thought by managers to be highly abrasive in meetings, but his technical staff loves him because he's good at solving problems. So how do you talk to somebody like this? Security as learning works because he's self-motivated, but avoid security as education. He's not going to have a college background to draw upon. He's completely self-taught. Focus on technology analogies. So Linux security as Microsoft security will work. Document security as data security will work. Security as care works if somebody has pets. It's not quite the same as security as protection. And then security as improvement works because of the technology piece that he likes to do. So there's some further reading you can go through. There are several resources out there. Or you can download my Lean Security comic, which covers some of this kind of stuff. So I don't see any cell phones going up. So there's my contact information. Any questions? Yes?
How do you make all those cool images?
They're called tag clouds, and there are various systems online that you basically upload the image, the blank, and then a word list, and it maps it in. Most of them have gone pay since I made this presentation, and I don't know of any free open source ones. So there's a project for you. Anything else? Yes?
Do you have any advice towards teaching yourself, like stimulating the brain to come up with metaphors on the fly? Is there a way to like practice that? Or?
So you can read that there's a book called Images of Organization by Gareth Morgan, which it is a massive tome, but it's an important read, and it talks about how metaphors are used in businesses. And once you start thinking about it, you start recognizing them. And it's really a matter of training your brain to recognize them than to come up with them, because once you recognize them, you're kind of building that list in your mind of different things. And then when you have the list, you can try them out on different people. Social Engineering, The Art of Human Hacking by Chris Hadnagy goes into some of this stuff as well, not directly because it's a social engineering book, but those are two good resources to get you started.
Is it detrimental to communicate exclusively using like tired or platitudinal metaphors?
Depends on who you're talking to.
Some people, I might just like tone out. It doesn't interest me or provoke me.
Well, I know what you're trying to say. I'm going to guess that in some cases, like if you're talking technically, like most people at this conference, you can just talk tech. You don't need to delve too much into metaphors because we all have a shared technical background. Where metaphors really come into handy is when you're talking to people outside of your field. And in that case, you're more trying to understand what's going on, and you're not as likely to get caught up in this metaphor is tiring. Metaphors get old and tired when they're mapping to things that you already have mapped, and you don't need to convey new data, right? Metaphors are useful for new data and bringing people into a conversation in a new way. They're old and boring if you already know the information. So I mean, that's more paying attention to, don't tell people stuff they already know than anything else. So, any other questions? Yes?
So when using metaphors, I mean, is it better to use them as kind of tightly as possible? I mean, the more expansive you try to make them, the more people start poking holes in them. So is it easier to like use one for an aspect and then maybe use another one for another aspect so people don't start kind of overthinking it or something?
So extending the metaphor is a problem, but targeting a metaphor is a problem as well. Because if you target it too narrowly and the person doesn't have the background, they're not going to have the expansion algorithm in their brain, and it's just not going to work at all. So try to make them broad enough to cover whatever space is in their brain, but the more you can learn about them, the more tightly you can target. So it's less about always do this and more about really know your audience, do your reconnaissance to figure things out before you talk to them. Anything else? All right, that's it.